So, on Thursday, for anyone who's following the Maine Senate primary, the establishment candidate dropped out. The establishment candidate, Janet Mills. And, this is going to have very big implications, not just on the Maine Senate itself, but also on politics. But, beyond the broader implications, let's be clear, when it comes to primary elections that are going on right now, lots of voters they have the option to choose between more progressive and more moderate candidates. In the case of Maine, oyster fisherman Graham Platner has been running for a while now, and he's had quite a lot of momentum, a lot of interest in his campaign. But he's a more progressive individual, whereas the Senate leadership and Democrats at large don't support progressive policies, don't support changes in leadership. So they recruited nearly 80-year-old Governor of Maine, Janet Mills, to run against him. Or, maybe this was already in the works because Platner did launch his campaign fairly early. But the fact that Janet Mills is now dropping out represents a total and a complete victory for Graham Platner. Absolute domination. So I want to talk about who Graham Platner is and what he represents in the Senate, because there's a lot of discourse about Graham Platner, not because of his positions or what kind of a senator he would be, but just this sort of shit slinging controversies, his Reddit history and misogynistic comments or whatever, and a Nazi tattoo. So if you ask me, Graham Platner is representative of a very, very large shift in American politics. Not because Graham Platner is the most leftist of all time, but because Graham Platner he adheres to a very simple political strategy of saying what you believe in and then saying that you're going to fight for it, which is always going to be more effective than whatever Democrats have been doing with this, weird neoliberal, we'd love to change things, but we actually can't. So doesn't that suck sort of agenda. But yeah, ultimately, Graham Platner, he supports single-payer healthcare. He supports, unions, things like the PRO Act, raising the minimum wage, good climate policy, things like that. The only real issue that I actually have with Graham Platner, because Graham Platner is a Majority Report viewer, seems like they've had a very big impact on how he approaches politics. The only real disagreement that I personally have with Graham Platner that I've seen is his desire to close the shipbuilding gap with China. Now, I find that to be an issue only because when it comes to militarism, when it comes to the sorts of wars that we have waged in the past and are waging currently, they require a much longer history. They require these myths to be constructed behind the scenes to make it to where those sorts of actions are seen as necessary and or legitimate. And the idea that you're closing a shipbuilding gap with China, to me, seems like the sort of policy or the sort of approach, the sort of perspective that leads to conflict further down the line, if he's successful at pushing for that change in the Senate in general. But beyond that, I think Graham Platner is a great candidate, and I think just the type of politics where people speak clearly is going to win. Not to mention the fact that Graham Platner is running in Maine, which is a fairly small state, and so he's got a much so speaking clearly is an important thing to do, but it's difficult because candidates have to also navigate media environments. And so navigating a media environment while saying what you believe and saying so clearly has been difficult in the past because the media has so much power in shaping how people interpret the messages of candidates. But for Graham Platner, being in such a small state, he has the ability to probably get straight one-to-one FaceTime with a very large percentage of the population, which I think will always work in favor of candidates like Platner, because, again, speaking clearly, having convictions, having a perspective, and pushing for what you believe in, as opposed to trying to push gently on this one lever to move things over, a quarter of a millimeter per decade, and hopefully in 18 centuries we'll finally have single-payer healthcare. And so yeah, Graham Platner, great candidate, very happy and excited about what his victory represents. And that's not just because I like him as a candidate, but what Graham Platner was able to do was to win so early, was to do so much work, put so much work in so far ahead of where and when establishment politicians put in work that they weren't even able to mount a challenge. Now, you see a different dynamic in Michigan, where Abdul Sayed, who I think is the most progressive candidate, he has to face off against more moderate figures that actually do have a bit of a constituency. and he can't just walk away with the nomination in the same way. But I do think, given the fact that Michigan's primary is in August, that over time we'll see a similar dynamic there as well. But yeah, Graham Platner, complete and total victory. This is what we're witnessing right now is a very important transition point in politics. We're witnessing the death of the long-standing narratives that have created the political outcomes that we're seeing, and we're witnessing the birth of what's going to come from that. Graham Platner, he again, like I said, the militarism is really my only issue with him. People talk about Nazi tattoo, yada yada. I really do not care about any of those things. Reddit history, it's mostly nonsense, and good policy. That's what's going to win. That's what's going to take us home. And that's what I'm very excited to get. Hopefully, Graham Platner, being one of the first, is, first on the Senate side, first, disruptor, first younger person. He's only 41, to really get there in the Senate and start to hold institutional power and really push this movement leftward forward in the country. You can't really predict how these things go, but that's where my expectation is, and that's what I think we're going to see in the coming months.